I had spent most of my 52 years around livestock. Cattle, goats, horses, chickens, you name it. I had probably raised it at some point. That was why I knew something was wrong the moment I stepped into the goat barn that morning. It was just after sunrise. The Texas heat hadn't arrived yet, and the air still carried that cool, dry feeling that disappears within an hour of daylight. I had been awake since 5, same as every other morning, and I'd already fed the cattle when I noticed the goats hadn't come running toward the fence. Usually they heard my boots before I even reached the barn. That morning there was nothing. No bleating, no scratching, no animals pushing against the wooden rails waiting for feed. Just silence. I stopped outside the barn. Something about that silence bothered me. I pushed the door open. The smell hit me first. Not rot, not blood. Something colder. Something almost metallic. I switched on the overhead light. 6 goats were lying on the wooden floor. For several seconds, I simply stared at them. They weren't torn apart. There were no chunks of flesh missing. No signs of a struggle. They looked as though someone had carefully laid them down. I stepped closer. Jesus. Each goat had 2 tiny puncture wounds on the side of its neck. I crouched beside the nearest one. I touched its fur. Dry. Completely dry. There wasn't a drop of blood anywhere. I looked at the floor. Nothing. The walls. Nothing. The other goats. Nothing. I had seen coyotes attack livestock before. I'd seen what a mountain lion could do. This wasn't either. Whatever had killed these animals hadn't simply killed them. It had taken something from them. I called Dr. Miller, the local veterinarian. He arrived about an hour later. He examined every body. He checked their mouths, eyes, hearts, and wounds. Eventually, he stood up and removed his gloves. I've never seen anything like this. What killed them? He looked at me. I don't know. Predator? He shook his head. No predator I know. I showed him the puncture wounds. He stared at them for a long time. Something drained these animals, he finally said. How? I don't know. Could a bat do it? Not like this. He packed his equipment. Before leaving, he stopped beside his truck. Mac, yeah? You sure nothing got into the barn? I checked the fence. No breaks. Then I'd be checking again. That night, I locked the farmhouse doors. I kept my rifle beside the bed. I wasn't afraid. At least that's what I told myself. At 2:13 a.m., I heard footsteps. I opened my eyes. For several seconds, I didn't move. Then I heard them again. Step. Pause. Step. Pause. I reached for the rifle. The sound was coming from outside. I got out of bed and looked through the window. Nothing. The ranch was completely dark. I grabbed my flashlight and walked outside. The beams swept across the yard. Nothing. Then I heard the barn door creak. Slowly, I raised the rifle. Who's there? No answer. I walked toward the barn. The door was slightly open. I knew I'd locked it. I pushed it wider. The flashlight beam moved across the stalls. Nothing. Then I heard something behind me. A footstep. I spun around. Nothing. Another step came from inside the barn. Heavy, slow, human sounding. I raised the rifle. Come out. Silence. Then another step. I moved toward it. The sound stopped. I searched every stall. Nothing. Whatever had been inside was gone. The next morning, another goat was dead. This time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. 4 long scratches crossed the wooden stall door. They were nearly 7 feet above the ground. I stood beneath them. I couldn't reach them, not even close. I stared at the scratches. Then I looked toward the ceiling. For the first time, I wondered if whatever was killing my animals wasn't an animal at all. That afternoon, I drove into town. I bought 3 trail cameras. I placed one beside the goat pen, one facing the barn, and one near the water trough. For 3 nights, nothing happened. On the 4th night, something appeared. I was sitting at the kitchen table when I checked the footage. The barn camera showed nothing unusual until 2:17 a.m. Then something entered the frame. At first, I thought it was a dog, a large dog. Then it stepped closer. I leaned toward the screen. It was completely hairless. Its skin was pale and stretched tightly over its body. Its legs were too long. Its back was hunched. Its head hung forward. I watched it walk toward the goat pen. Something about the movement bothered me. It wasn't walking like a dog. It was walking like a person who had never learned how to walk properly. Then it stopped. Its head slowly lifted. It looked directly at the camera. I froze. 2 wide eyes stared into the lens. The creature stood completely still. Then it rose, slowly. Its spine straightened. Its shoulders lifted. Its head came higher, higher, higher. I watched in disbelief as it stood upright. It was nearly 7 feet tall. Then it raised one long arm. A claw touched the fence. The creature tilted its head and smiled. I stopped breathing. It wasn't an animal's smile. There was something deliberate about it. Something intelligent. It knew the camera was there. It knew I was watching. The footage suddenly cut to black. I checked the water trough camera. The creature appeared at 2:21 a.m., 4 minutes later. But this time it wasn't near the goats. It was standing beside my farmhouse, looking directly at my bedroom window. I checked the timestamp again. 2:21. I looked toward the window, then back at the screen. The creature had been watching my bedroom. I rewound the footage. The previous night's recording showed something standing in the same spot, and the night before that. And the night before that. It had been there for days, maybe weeks. I just hadn't known. I barely slept that night. The following morning, I drove into town to see Earl. Earl was 78 and had lived in the area longer than anyone I knew. When I showed him the footage, his expression changed. "You know what that is?" He didn't answer immediately. People around here have different names for it. Like what? He looked at me. Chupacabra? I almost laughed. Almost. But Earl didn't. "That's a story," I said. "Maybe." "You believe it?" "I believe livestock don't drain themselves." He leaned closer. "Mac, don't worry about what it looks like." "Why?" "Because the thing that worries me," he paused, "is that it's learned where you sleep." I felt something cold move through my stomach. Earl told me about another rancher who had experienced something similar decades ago. Dead livestock. No blood. Footsteps. Dogs disappearing. Then one morning, the rancher disappeared too. His house was unlocked. Nothing had been stolen. But there were muddy footprints throughout the kitchen. They weren't animal tracks. They looked almost human. I returned home before sunset. That night, I locked every door, every window. I put my rifle beside my bed. At 2:13 a.m., the footsteps began. Except this time, they weren't coming from the barn. They were coming from the porch. Step, pause, step, pause. They moved around the house, then stopped outside my bedroom. I stared at the window. Nothing. Then 2 pale eyes appeared behind the glass. I reached for my rifle. The creature didn't attack. Instead, it raised one long claw and tapped the window. Tap. Silence. Tap. Silence. Tap. My blood went cold. It was copying me. Earlier that evening, I'd been sitting at the kitchen table tapping my finger against the wood. The creature had heard me, and now it was repeating the sound. I slowly turned my head. There was another sound, coming from the hallway. A footstep. I looked toward the bedroom door. Another step. Then another. Something was standing in the darkness outside my room. I raised my rifle. The pale eyes outside the window remained fixed on me. Then I realized something. There were 2 sets of footsteps. One outside, one inside. I turned toward the hallway. A tall, pale figure stood there. Its body was almost human. Almost. Its arms hung far too low. Its fingers touched the floor. Its head tilted toward me. And behind it in the darkness, I saw another pair of white eyes. Then another. Then another. I finally understood. The trail camera hadn't shown me the Chupacabra. It had shown me one of them. I fired. The farmhouse exploded with noise. Glass shattered. The creature in the hallway vanished. I didn't wait. I ran to the bathroom, smashed the window, climbed through it, and sprinted toward my truck. I never looked back, not until I reached the road. When I finally did, I saw 6 pale figures standing around my farmhouse, watching me leave. And one of them raised its hand, almost like it was waving goodbye. I called the cops. They didn't believe me. Not completely. I couldn't blame them. If somebody had told me the same story, I probably wouldn't have believed it either. When I brought them back to the ranch, there was nothing there. No creatures, no footprints, no broken windows except the bathroom window I'd smashed escaping. The farmhouse was empty. The barn was empty. The goats were gone. The 6 dead animals had disappeared. That frightened me more than anything. The police searched the property for hours. They found nothing. Eventually, one of the officers asked me if I'd been drinking. I told him no. He nodded. He didn't believe me. But there was one thing they couldn't explain. The trail camera. The footage showed 6 figures surrounding the farmhouse. 6. Not 1. Not 2. 6. And in the final frame, there was something else. A person standing directly in front of the camera. I recognized the clothes immediately. My jeans, my boots, my old work shirt. It looked like me, but it wasn't me. The face was blurred by the infrared light. The officers assumed it was someone trespassing. I knew better. I'd been driving away when that footage was recorded. I left the ranch that day. I stayed in a motel in town. I told myself I would never go back. For 3 nights, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those pale eyes. Then, on the 4th night, I heard tapping. 3 slow taps against the motel window. Tap. Pause. Tap. Pause. Tap. I didn't move. The curtains were closed. I didn't open them. The tapping stopped. Then came a sound from inside the room. A footstep. I grabbed the rifle I'd kept with me. I turned on every light. Nothing. I searched the bathroom, the closet, under the bed. Nothing. But when I returned to the window, I noticed something scratched into the glass. 4 long lines, 7 feet high. I couldn't reach that height. I packed my belongings before sunrise. I needed answers. So I went back to Earl. He was sitting on his porch when I arrived. He looked at me for a long time. "You saw more than one?" It wasn't a question. I nodded. 6. Earl looked toward the road. "Then they're not hunting animals anymore." "What are they hunting?" He didn't answer. I stepped closer. "Earl." He finally looked at me. "People." He told me something he'd never mentioned before. Years ago, there had been a series of disappearances across several ranches. The victims had something in common. They had all reported strange livestock deaths shortly before disappearing. Goats, sheep, calves, dogs. Every time there were 2 puncture wounds. Every time there was no blood. And every time someone reported hearing footsteps outside their house. Why didn't anybody investigate? People did. What happened? They disappeared too. I felt my stomach tighten. Earl handed me an old photograph. It showed a farmhouse surrounded by cattle. Standing beside it was a rancher I'd never seen before. On the back was a date, 1978. "That's the man who disappeared," Earl said. I stared at the photograph. There was something behind him. A pale figure standing near the barn. It was almost invisible, but I could see the eyes. White. I looked at Earl. "How long have they been here?" He shook his head. "Longer than us." I returned to my ranch that afternoon. I shouldn't have, but I needed to know what had happened. The property looked different. Not physically. Something about it felt wrong. The animals were gone. The barn doors were open. Inside, I found the scratches. There were more now. Dozens. Across the walls. Across the doors. Across the beams. Some were almost 8 feet high. Then I noticed something else. A trail of footprints. They began outside the barn. They crossed the dirt. They stopped at the farmhouse, then continued inside. Human-shaped, but far too long. I followed them. They led to my bedroom, then stopped beside the bed. I looked down. There were scratches carved into the wooden floor. A circle. Inside the circle was a single word, Mac. I backed away. Something moved upstairs. I knew there was nothing upstairs. I had checked, but I heard footsteps. Slow, heavy. I raised my rifle. "Who's there?" A voice answered, my voice. "Who's there?" I froze. The voice came again. "Who's there?" It was perfect. My exact voice. Then it laughed. I ran outside. That night, I stayed in my truck. I watched the farmhouse. At 2:13 a.m., the lights came on. Every single light. One by one. Kitchen, hallway, bedroom, bathroom. Then I saw a figure standing behind my bedroom window. It looked like me. Same clothes, same height, Same face. It stared toward the truck. Then it smiled. I started the engine. The figure disappeared. I drove away. But I knew something now. They weren't simply watching me. They were learning me. My voice, my habits, my movements, my home, everything. And if the thing on the camera was wearing my clothes, I had to ask myself one terrifying question. Why? The answer came 3 nights later. I received a phone call from my own number. I stared at the screen. My phone showed my name. I answered, "Hello?" Silence. Then I heard breathing. Slow breathing. "Who is this?" My own voice answered, "Mac." I dropped the phone. It rang again. I didn't answer. Again. 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 Finally, I picked it up. The voice whispered, "You left us." I couldn't speak. Then it said, "We're still hungry." The call ended. The next morning, Earl was missing. His house was unlocked. His truck was still outside. The front door stood open. I walked inside. There were muddy footprints across the kitchen. Human footprints. But they were almost twice the length of mine. They led toward the hallway. I followed them. They stopped beside a mirror. Written across the glass in something dark were 4 words. "We know you, Mac." I backed away. Then I noticed the reflection. There was someone standing behind me. I turned. Nothing. I looked back at the mirror. The figure was still there. It looked like me. But its smile was too wide, and its eyes were completely white. The reflection raised its hand. I didn't. It pressed one long finger against the glass, then tapped, tap, tap, tap. The same rhythm. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, but as I drove away, I saw something standing beside Earl's house. Then another. Then another. 6 pale figures, all watching me. And standing in front of them was something wearing Earl's clothes. I realized then that Earl hadn't simply disappeared. They had learned him too, and they were getting better. I spent the next week hiding in a motel. I didn't sleep. I didn't trust mirrors. I didn't answer unknown calls. And I never looked out the window after dark. But the creatures didn't need to come inside. They already knew where I was. Every night at exactly 2:13 a.m., something appeared outside the motel. I never saw it directly. I only saw the shadows. Sometimes there was one. Sometimes there were 6. One night I heard my own voice outside the door. Mac. I sat on the bed with my rifle pointed toward the entrance. Mac, open the door. It sounded exactly like me. "Please." I didn't answer. Then the voice changed. It became Earl's. "Mac, it's me." I shut my eyes. No. Then it became my father's voice. My father had been dead for 20 years. "Son." My hands began shaking. "Open the door." I didn't move. Then all 6 voices spoke at once. "Mac." The hallway fell silent. The next morning, there were scratches on the outside of my motel door. 4 long lines, nearly 7 feet above the floor. I knew I couldn't stay there. I decided to return to the ranch one final time. Not because I wanted to, because I had started to realize something. The creatures weren't random. They were following a pattern. Livestock, then dogs, then people, then imitation. They were learning, and whatever they learned became part of them. I drove back to my ranch just before sunset. The property was empty, completely empty. No cattle, no goats, no birds. Even the insects seemed gone. I entered the farmhouse. The air smelled stale. I walked into the kitchen. There were photographs scattered across the floor. Photographs I'd never seen before. Earl, the rancher from 1978. Other people, dozens of them, all ranchers, all missing. On the wall was a map. Red marks covered Texas. Some were clustered around my area. Others stretched hundreds of miles away. I realized the creatures weren't confined to my ranch. They were everywhere. Then I saw something written beneath the map. They come when they are hungry. Another sentence appeared beneath it. They stay when they learn your name. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned. Nothing. Another step. I raised my rifle. "Show yourself," a voice answered from upstairs. My voice. "You already know me." I slowly climbed the stairs. The hallway was dark. At the end stood a figure. It looked like me. Same clothes, same boots, same face. But its skin was too pale. Its eyes were white. It smiled. "You don't belong here anymore." I raised my rifle. "What are you?" It tilted its head. "I am you." "No." It smiled wider. "I know how you walk." It took a step. "I know how you talk." Another step. "I know what you fear." Another. "I know where you sleep." I fired. The creature disappeared. The bullet struck the wall. Then something grabbed my shoulder. I spun around. Another creature stood behind me. I fired again. It screamed. Not like an animal, like a human. Then every light in the farmhouse went out. Darkness swallowed the hallway. I heard footsteps everywhere. 1, 2, 3, 6. They were surrounding me. I ran downstairs. The front door slammed shut. I pulled it, locked. I turned. 6 pale figures stood across the kitchen. Their bodies were unnaturally still. Their eyes reflected the moonlight. One stepped forward. Then another. I raised my rifle. But something was wrong. They weren't attacking. They were waiting. Then the first creature spoke. "Mac." The others repeated it. "Mac, Mac, Mac." 6 voices, 1 name. Then the creature closest to me stepped aside. Someone was standing behind them. A human figure, wearing my clothes, holding my rifle. I looked down. My hands were empty. The figure smiled. I recognized the face. Mine. The creature wearing my face walked toward me. I stumbled backward. "No." It raised my hand. It copied the way I held my fingers. Then it spoke in my voice. "They'll believe me." I understood. That was why they'd been watching. Why they'd copied my voice. Why they'd worn my clothes. They didn't want to kill me. They wanted to replace me. I ran toward the window. The glass shattered. I fell outside. Behind me, I heard footsteps. I ran across the yard. The 6 creatures followed. I reached my truck. The engine started. I slammed the truck into reverse. One of the creatures stood directly behind me. It didn't move. I hit the accelerator. The truck struck it. The creature disappeared beneath the tires. I drove. I didn't stop. I drove until sunrise. Then I stopped beside an old gas station. I sat there shaking. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. My face looked normal. My eyes looked normal. I touched my cheek. Warm skin. Human. I laughed. I almost cried. I thought I'd escaped. Then my phone rang. I looked at the screen. My own number. I answered. There was silence. Then a voice whispered, "Mac." I stared at the rearview mirror. Someone was sitting in the back seat. I slowly turned. Nothing. I looked forward again. And that's when I saw them. 6 figures standing in the road behind me, watching. One of them stepped forward. It was wearing my clothes, my boots, my hat, my face. I looked down at my own hands. There was dirt beneath my fingernails. But I hadn't been working the ranch that morning. I checked my reflection again. Something was wrong. My eyes looked pale, almost white. I touched the glass. The reflection smiled. I didn't. I stopped breathing. The reflection lifted one finger and tapped against the mirror. Tap. Pause. Tap. Pause. Tap. I understood then. The creatures hadn't been trying to get into my house. They hadn't been trying to kill me. They had been studying me, practicing me, learning everything they needed. Because the thing that had escaped the ranch that morning might not have been me. I looked at the road. 6 figures stood behind the truck. Then I looked at the rearview mirror. The thing wearing my face was still smiling. And suddenly I couldn't remember whether I had escaped the ranch or whether something else had escaped wearing me. The last thing I remember is hearing my own voice whisper from the back seat, "Don't worry, Mac." A pause. "We'll take care of the ranch." Then the phone rang again. This time, I answered, and I heard 6 voices breathing on the other end. Hungry, waiting, learning. And somewhere in rural Texas, on an abandoned cattle ranch several miles from the nearest town, the goats began screaming. Then everything went silent, because the goats were never the prey. They were only practice, and whatever had come to the ranch had finally learned how to be human.